what I want us to do is remind this, not because of a recap, but I want you to start to think about how Jesus uses the book of Daniel to both define who he is and his ministry. We've just come through Christmas. You're probably aware. And we celebrate baby Jesus. And the Bible says he grew in knowledge and wisdom. We don't think of Jesus in the manger this sounds trite, but with a God-sized brain. He's a baby with all the synapses needing to be formed in the way that the mind works and to learn to walk and everything else. Truly human. Somewhere along that journey, he came to understand his Messiahhood, and he came into greater communion with his Father. So that by the time of his ministry, that was all completely worked out. Yeah? How did Jesus come to this understanding of the type of Messiah that he was going to be? The people were all expecting a different Messiah. Right? But Jesus, in his growth of wisdom and knowledge and in truth and communion with the Father and the Holy Spirit, I believe as well, came to see his role, but he's defining it in ways that other people didn't. So everybody else is expecting a different Messiah. But he saw in the Old Testament scriptures pictures of himself. And that really is very important. And Daniel plays a major part in that growing concept of Jesus' own knowledge of his own Messiahhood. Right? I think that's profoundly important. It's the enthronement of Jesus before the day of judgment. So that is a scene in chapter 7 in the heavenlies about the very end. Okay, who Daniel is speaking to. We've said it's the Jews in exile on their return to the homeland. We've said it's written in Aramaic and Hebrew. And I want to just point out, just in passing, the importance of the Septuagint. The Old Testament Hebrew we've mentioned had no vowels in it. Right? What a nightmare for a scholar to try and figure out exactly what's meant by a bunch of consonants. Forgive me if there's anybody who's ethnically diverse here, but it would sound worse than Welsh. You mightn't realize, but the Masoretic text, and that's simply what we call the Old Testament in Hebrew. In Hebrew with vowels in it, right, was only written between 600 to 1000 AD. Have you got that? So the Masoretic text that all of our Old Testaments are translated into, or from rather, every Bible that you have, that text only existed 1,000 years after Christ. Before that, it was a Hebrew without any vowels in it. And that makes things very, very tricky. But this is why the Septuagint is important. Because it was the translation of that Old Testament text. And it's a language that's preserved that we understand. And it was written 250 BC. So it was written when they had the Old Testament Hebrew. Yeah? And the scholars, the 70 scholars who translated it, would understand completely what the Hebrew meant. Yes? Now, I'll just give you an example of something in a moment, but we've also got what's called the Targums, and I'll remind you just in case you forget. Targums are simply the Aramaic translations. And don't forget the Jews have been speaking Aramaic since captivity, since the time of Daniel. Right? So, That's very helpful as well, because some of those targums still exist. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947. For the first time, they could go back to the Hebrew before the Masoretic text, and they could look at it without its vowels, and they could say, does it match up? Does it help? And yes, it does. Wonderful. But there are some very great difficulties occasionally. I'm going to give you one right now. Turn in your Bibles, if you would, please, to 1 Samuel 13, verse 1. When you find it, somebody read it out. 1 Samuel 13, verse 1. Ladies at the back, if you don't have Bibles with you, I don't know what to say. I'm not going to embarrass you. I won't point you out.
Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel.
So hang on. Saul was 1 year old when he became king, and then reigned for 2 years. Hang on. He was head and shoulders taller than everybody else and more handsome than everybody else in the country. He was a big baby, wasn't he? Somebody else read what their version's got.
Saul lived for 1 year and then became king.
Okay, yeah.
When he had reigned for 2 years.
All right, another version, please. Because it doesn't make sense, does it? Let me put some other versions up there for you. The NIV says, when Saul was 30-year-old, he became king. And he reigned over Israel for 42 years. Hang on. You've just read he was 1 year old. And when he was 2, he reigned again. King James reigned 1 year, and when he reigned 2 years over Israel. It doesn't even make sense grammatically. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. What about the Amplified? Saul was 40 years old when he began to reign, and when he had reigned over 2 years over Israel. Well, in the Jewish one, it's Shaul was blank years when he began his reign, and had ruled Israel for 2 years. CEV version says, Saul was a young man when he became king and ruled Israel for 2 years. What's going on? Okay. The Septuagint does not have that verse in it at all. There's no Greek copy of it. And what's more, there is no ancient Hebrew scroll with it in. It's in the Masoretic text, so it was translated from Hebrew into the Masoretic, but there's no ancient scroll left anywhere on the planet. Well, you know, old scrolls fall apart, don't they? Yeah? But it's interesting. We can't go back. We can't say, what does it say in the Hebrew? Because there's no scroll left with that verse in it. It's one of the few verses in the Bible where this happens. There's occasional words where it happens, but this is a whole verse, which is why people have tried to backfill to say, what's it trying to say here? Yeah? The King James took the bare bones of the Masoretic and put in 1 year, but it clearly doesn't make sense. And all the modern translations work back over from the time he dies and then subtracts the years and then say it was 30 or 40, depending on how you count his years. Right? So can you see how important the Greek version is? I know that's nothing particularly to do with Daniel, but I hope you'll find it helpful. Because sometimes you ask yourself, well, why? Why mess around? We've got the Bible. We've got the original Bible. It's called the King James. And we don't really need to look anywhere else. Really? Clearly we do. The vision of heaven, we've talked about, the divine council, the Elohim. I'm just going through this fast so that you can see what we've talked about in our review. If you want a copy of this, feel free, you can have a copy of this. So God's an Elohim, but not all Elohim are God. That's the important thing to remember. God's unique and all-powerful. There is nobody like him, eternally existent and not created. Amen to that? Good. Good, good. We have Elohim, God's council of rulers in Psalm 82, which are clearly divine beings. God's taking his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then he says later on, although you're gods, you could die like men. Why didn't you fight for justice, etc.? Read that when you can. In 32, Deuteronomy 32, we find he fixed the borders of men according to the numbers of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. Psalm 89, you'll see, who is the Lord among the heavenly beings? You can see there, I've put a bit more technical stuff down if anyone wants to get into it with what the Hebrew is. As I say, you can have a copy of this PowerPoint if you want. And what I want to just stress with you now is this. I am not claiming to have all the right answers. I'm really not. All I'm hoping to do is to raise the right questions. Okay? Seriously, that's all. If we ask them the right questions, we might have to be prepared to live in faith without answers. But at least if we've got the right questions, we'll understand some of the challenges and how basically to protect yourself from false teaching. Because there are many, many people, especially in the days of YouTube, who want to become the speciality preacher in end times with something new and novel to say. Because the only way you can get an audience is if you're new and novel in what you've got to offer. And there's some right people around. Hey ho. This is a poem by a friend of mine called Steve Turner. History repeats itself. Has to. No one listens. I want to come on to the angel of the Lord, and we're getting into the meat of tonight now, before the break. And I want to just talk about this idea of the angel of the Lord. The reason why is that we will struggle with understanding some major passages of the Old Testament unless we nail this question down. And there are a lot of the sects who get this entirely wrong, especially the Jehovah's Witnesses, probably. Exodus 3 in 13, and then I'm going to go to 14. Moses says, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God says, I am who I am. That is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. It's pretty clear, isn't it? Yeah. So, who tells Moses? God. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Yeah. Just something to try and contemplate for a second, and this is difficult. But the name of Yahweh isn't just a personal pronoun. In Scripture, the phrase, the name, actually signifies the presence of Yahweh. The name is personified and is used interchangeably with Yahweh himself. I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. So it's really important when God speaks and says, I am who I am, Yahweh. Yeah? Very important. Okay. Let's read back into Exodus again. And Moses was a shepherd with the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. This is just before the bit we've read. And he led the flock to the west of the desert, and he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb, not Sinai, incidentally. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire. Hang on, what's that say? Who appeared to him in the bush? The angel of the Lord. Hang on. Haven't we just said it was God speaking out the bush? Yeah? And he looked, and the bush was consumed with fire. The bush wasn't being consumed. And Moses said, let me turn aside and see this great sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? And Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see. Hang on, it's an angel in the bush. Right? And God called to him. Who called to him from the bush? God. Said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And he said, you mustn't come near. Take off your sandals, your feet, because the place where you stand is holy ground. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid of looking at God. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because the text clearly says it was the angel of Yahweh was in the bush, verse 2. When Moses looks at the bush in verse 3, it has Yahweh observing him and calling to him from the midst of the bush. Both the angel and the visible Yahweh in human form and the invisible Yahweh are characters in the burning bush scene. If you're not scratching your head by now, you're not listening. When we go into Stephen's sermon in the New Testament, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of the burning bush. An angel. Into verse 35, he was sent to be their ruler, delivered by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. Hang on, does that open up a space? Maybe. The name of Yahweh is in the angel. Remember I talked about the name being the presence of God? If you look at Exodus 23, for example, I won't read all this out. You can see where it's bold. But for my name is in him. And it starts off by saying, I'm about to send an angel before you to guard you on your way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Be attentive and listen to his. Don't rebel against him, for he will not forgive your transgressions. For my name is in him. And if you listen attentively to his voice and do all I say, I will be an enemy to the enemies and a foe to the foes. The angel has the authority to pardon sins or not, a status that belongs to God. God tells Moses that the reason his angel has this authority is my name is in him. And what you're going to come to find is the Old Testament uses Yahweh and his angel interchangeably. We can come to Judges. Yahweh brought us up out of and our ancestors from the land of Egypt. If you go to Judges, that's in Joshua. If you go to Judges 2, the angel of Yahweh went up and I brought you out of Egypt. Right? This is going somewhere, incidentally. In Isaiah, you're going to find more the same. I don't want to slow the pace down. So all I'm saying is if you want this PowerPoint, you're more than welcome to have it. One of the most interesting ones is the story of Gideon in Judges 2. The angel of Yahweh goes there and makes a promise. I will never break my covenant with you, my covenant. Their gods will be a trap for you. And as the angel of Yahweh spoke these words, all the Israelites and people wept bitterly. Sorry, this is just before Gideon. This is where God says, no longer am I going to turn up for you guys. Right? This is the retreat, if you like. So Yahweh and his angel are one, yet separate. When we come to Gideon, the angel of Yahweh comes and sits on an oak. The angel appeared to him, Yahweh is with you, you mighty warrior. And then later, a couple of verses later, it says, and Yahweh turned to him and said, so can you see the angel and Yahweh are interchangeably bouncing backwards and forwards from each other. And this gives rise to what we call the two powers of heaven. Now, this is really interesting because after the time of Daniel, the Jewish theologians started to work this out. And they're starting to say, hey, there's actually two powers. There's the visible Yahweh and the invisible Yahweh. You got it? They're using these words, the two powers, the visible and the invisible. And sometimes they're distinguished and other times they look together. And interesting too that, for example, in Exodus, when Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel, 70 again, go up and they see the God of Israel. Yeah? And under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. Yeah? You know what lapis lazuli looks like, don't you? Those beautiful turquoise hues. That's in Exodus. When you get to Ezekiel, there came a voice from the vault, and above the vault, over their heads, it looked like the throne of lapis lazuli, and high above the throne was a figure like that of a man. And I saw that what appeared from the waist up looked like glowing metal full of fire, and from down it looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Appearance of a rainbow on the clouds on a rainy day. So there was the radiance all around him. Now, Jesus picks this up, and he turns around and says, nobody has seen the Father. Only me. Only me. Only I've seen him. Right? He's speaking very much into this. But again, his concept of Messiahhood, I'm sure, is formed out of that vision that you're going to see of the Son of Man in the later chapters, where it's described in exactly the same terms as Ezekiel. And don't forget, Ezekiel was a contemporary of Daniel, just lived in a different part of the country, right? And was getting prophecies at the same time. We see the invisible God, or rather the visible God on top of the mountain with the 70 elders on Mount Sinai. And yet Yahweh says to Moses, go on the cleft of the rock because you can't see me. You're going to cast the glory as I come past. And yet here's Moses and his pals all sitting down looking at God on his throne on this pavement of lapis lazuli. Yeah, exactly the same language as Ezekiel. But it's interesting because Jesus, as I say, says no one's seen the Father except the one who's from God. But not only that, how is Jesus described by John, the gospel writer, at the very beginning? In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. What have we just said? My name is with, yeah? Even that opening by John talks about the deity of Christ and the presence of the Father in the Son. Yeah. Now it's interesting, Judaism pronounced that the two powers teaching was a heresy 200 years after the time of Jesus, when Christianity was spreading like wildfire and they wanted to distance themselves from it. So from the time of Daniel, the Jews believed in the two powers of heaven. When it comes to after Jesus, well, no. How did the people at the time of Jesus interpret Daniel? Because you can see what's important here is that we spill out of the borders of just looking at the text itself to understanding the importance of Daniel on a larger stage. And it might surprise you. So what I want to do, they thought it had all come true. At the time of Jesus, they thought everything in the book of Daniel has come to pass. And they call it the Antiochian crisis. Now, what does that mean? There was a guy called Antiochus Epiphanes. The city of Antioch gets its name from him because that was his capital, right? And I'll talk a bit about him in a minute or so. But what we've got to do is go to the book of Maccabees. Now, the funny thing is, if you're a Catholic, you'll know about the book of Maccabees. But if you're a Proddy, you probably don't. The original King James Version had the book of Maccabees in it. But don't forget the King James Version underwent radical rewrites. Yeah. The King James Version you see now is not the same as the one in 1660 odd. Right? And the book of Maccabees is the account of what happened. I might mention a couple of gruesome details along the way. If you're of a faint disposition, just blush and fan yourself with a piece of paper until you recover. But some of the details in this account is incredible. The Maccabees brothers, Maccabees literally means hammer. There was the father and sons came from a small village, and the country had been invaded. And I'll talk more about it in a second. But basically, the rebellion that takes place, and all the events that take place, and something in particular we're going to look at in chapter 8, at the time of Jesus, everybody said, well, that came true already. And yet, Jesus is going to take bits of Daniel, and he's going to say, yeah, but put them into prophetic form yet again. This time about AD 70 in the destruction of the temple. And then John is going to come along after the destruction of the temple in the book of Revelation, and he's going to take bits of Daniel and bits of what Jesus said about the temple, and he's going to throw them further into the future. Understand? But it's important that we start here by seeing the perspective, the way of thinking at the time of Jesus. Okay, this is a very, very fast overview. I'm going back because we talked about 4 kingdoms in chapter 7, and I said we'd address it. We're not going to do it in detail because we'll deal with it in chapter 8. But I just want to say the obvious question. Which 4 kingdoms is the first part of chapter 7 all about? At the time of Abraham, I'm just going very quickly in maps and showing you the world empires that have taken place. So at the time of Abraham, there was the Sumer and Akkadian empires. We know from Genesis, when it talks about Nimrod, the beginning of his kingdom was in Akkad and Sumer, and it's escaped me, but never mind. But we can see maybe that Nimrod's first world empire is here. So if you see, that might start, if you look down at the bottom part of the green version there, that's where Akkad was, and Nippur and where, of course, Abraham comes from. So you've got to put Abraham in this sort of context at around this sort of time. Okay? There's the Hurrian kingdoms to the top. There is the Canaan was occupied as time goes on. By the time of Moses, obviously you've got Egypt. So whereas Egypt is one of the earliest civilizations, we don't talk about the Egyptian empire. And the reason is they don't really stretch out of their borders that far. They do occasionally get up into Syria, occasionally get up into Israel, but by and large, the Egyptians stay in their area. So we don't consider them a world empire. Okay. By the time of Moses, the Hittite Empire was growing. The Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylon, they were fledgling. They were very low level. They weren't big kingdoms at this point. But you can see where they are on the map. By the time of David, Assyria is in that dark green area, not the light green area. So they're already starting to get big, right? And over time, over the next 1,000 years, they will eventually become the people that invade northern Israel. Okay? And of course, this is the time just before the conquest of Israel. So what I'm going to suggest is, although there's been some big kingdoms there, do they count as the 4 kingdoms to Daniel? Probably not, but don't be dogmatic. By the time of Hezekiah and Isaiah, the larger Assyrian Empire had conquered down into Egypt, but it was still Jerusalem escaped. By the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, we have the Babylonian Empire. Now, can you see how big things are getting? Yep. It starts small, gets bigger, get bigger. But now, good grief, look at the size of this Babylonian Empire. And yet it's short-lived. Doesn't really last that long. And then we see the Medes, who are the first people to come in and conquer Babylon. And if you want to see where Media is, it's really that south of the Caspian Sea that you can see there. More or less where Tehran is nowadays, just to the south of the Caspian Sea. And then what happens is, one of the people who gets the throne of Media is also a Persian. And by the time of Daniel is an old man, and 2 generations later at the time of Esther, we have Persia and Media combined together. And this time it's enormous. And of course, by the time of Esther, we're going to find this is the Xerxes, the one she's married to, is the one who tries to invade Greece. You know, the Spartans, passive Thermopylae and all that, and the Athenian defense. Just look here at how it forces its way into Lydia, which is, you know, that western part of Turkey. That's where King Croesus was. Can you remember the expression, rich as Croesus? Yeah? Fabulously wealthy. And the Persians plunder there, but they get right to the Dardanelles, the edge of the Black Sea, and the crossing over to Greece. And of course, by Xerxes, he's wanting to push across there to extend his kingdom into Greece. Rome is already a kingdom by this time, not an empire, but Rome is already a kingdom and involving themselves in the wars that are taking place here. Right? So enormous. So is it fair to say the first kingdom is that Babylon? Probably. Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason we say that is because of the identification in chapter 2, when we see that statue, and Daniel says, "You, king, are the head of gold." Yeah. Then we have this Persian Media Empire. Then we find Alexander the Great, after the defeat of the Persians, he decides, right, I'm not having the Persians coming back and taking war on us. We're going to go to them. If you fancy a fight, bonny lad, we'll have a fight. And so they now invade right across. And he gets right to the door of India. Enormous, incredible story about how that happened. And then he dies. And his kingdom is split up. Remember this. It is ruled, the 4 kingdoms that are broken it up into here are ruled by Greek kings. Or Greek sub-kings, if you like. So the Ptolemies were Greek. They go and take over Egypt. And as I said before, Queen Cleopatra, who was around at the time of when Herod the Great was young, Herod and Cleopatra didn't get on. They were always skirmishing together. But she was a Greek queen of Egypt. Yeah, the ruling elite were the Ptolemies. And what happens here next, by the time of Maccabees and the father and the sons, we have the Seleucid Empire, ruled by Antiochus Epiphanes. Do you know what the name Antiochus Epiphanes means? God manifest. He claimed to be a god. In fact, it might be said that he boasted great things. By the time of Jesus in the early church, you have the Roman Empire. So when I say to you, read chapter 7 again and try and figure out which 4 empires, we could say Babylon, Media, Persian, Seleucid. That doesn't fit well with conventional teaching. But the people of the time of Jesus thought that that was the case. That's what their scholars wrote about. They were the 4 kingdoms in Daniel. Interesting. The most terrible kingdom for the Jews was arguably the Seleucid kingdom. Let's read Daniel 8 together. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. And I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam, and in the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. And I looked up, and there was before me a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. We're going to see the angel explain shortly that this is, in fact, the 2 horns. It is Medo-Persian. Right? We're going to see that in a minute. One of the horns was longer than the other. Well, but grew up later. Yeah, that's Persia. It started as the rump of the partnership, but it overtook the Median. So it was the Persians. So the Persian kings, Xerxes, etc. Right? And now watch the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. Yes, they did. And they charged towards the west. It was Xerxes trying to invade Greece. Passive Thermopylae, Spartans. Yeah. No animal could stand against it. None could rescue it from its power. It did its please and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west. Crossed the whole earth without touching the ground. Yeah, it did. It came towards the 2-horned ram I'd seen standing beside the canal where he lived in Persia. Yeah, standing beside the canal. And the ram was powerless to stand against it, and the goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it. And none could rescue the ram from its power. And the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. Because Alexander the Great was 30-year-old and died. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Yes, it broke up. And there was 4 Greek kings took charge. Are you with me? And out of one of them came a horn which started small but grew in power to the south and the east and towards the beautiful land. Antiochus Epiphanes came to the throne and went down, and he put in place a puppet high priest. And he built a gymnasium. He put Jason in. And the gymnasium was a place where you would fight and run and do everything else, but it was done naked. It was at the foot of the temple. And he put his puppet master in, who loved the games, loved them. And all the priests in the temple used to go down. They used to cut the services short. Luke, watch out. Keep your eye on the diaconate. Cut the services short. And get out quick so they could go down and watch the games in the gym, the gymnasium, the athletic forum, if you like. And of course, it became unfashionable, frankly, to be circumcised. You might think that that can't be remedied. Some of them tried. Inventive use of string, pliers, and weights. And people were trying to reverse their circumcisions. Now, I'm not saying this for effect, although it's worth seeing your faces. But can you imagine what this meant to the Orthodox? The circumcision that was the binding contract between Israel and God. Yeah? Wow. And then he continued down into Egypt and had a good go at Egypt again. But Rome actually came to the Ptolemies' aid. And basically, the Roman general came, and Antiochus was standing there, and the Roman general said, "You either tell me here and now that all your plans against Egypt have come to an end, or else." And Antiochus said, "Well," and the Roman general put a circle around him in the sand. You've heard of the expression, the line in the sand. This was it. And he said, "You take one step outside this circle without that promise and you die." And Antiochus gave in. But he wasn't a happy chap. He went back to Israel. I'll read some of the things that he did. But basically, while he was in Egypt, they kicked Jason out and brought his brother in to try and take charge again. This time when Antiochus comes back up into Israel, he is absolutely humiliated by Rome, lost to Egypt, and he's determined he will stamp out Judaism. He bans circumcision. Any child found circumcised would be, they find the mother, they would slaughter the child, and they'd hang the child around the mother's neck and sew it on to rot as a carcass. They insisted on the burning of the books of the law. Virtually everything you come across in Nazi Germany, virtually, you find the forerunner of it at this time. And then what's more, he installed a statue of Zeus inside the temple. And then he orders the slaughter of, in fact, he does it himself. He slaughters a pig on the altar in the temple. Let's go back to reading this chapter 8. It grew until it reached the hosts of heaven, and it threw down some of the starry hosts to the earth and trampled on them. You can see that as metaphor, incidentally. It set itself up to be the great commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered, this is the horn, in everything it did, and truth was thrown down to the ground. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation," or the desolation of, that's referred to, the surrender of the sanctuary and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. And he said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Now it's interesting because the Seventh-day Adventists take the reconsecration of the temple that happens under the Maccabees and says these evenings and mornings are really years. Add 2,300 to that, and that's why they come up in 18 whatever that Jesus was coming back again. It was the addition of this 2,300. But in fairness, it's 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, again, the Greek has this separated as like 2,300 evenings and mornings, so that's like 1,500 and odd. You with me? So it's either 2,300 days evenings and mornings. Anyone with a calculator will come to 6 and a bit years. Yeah? Or it's half that. 3.5 years, roughly. 3.14, I think it is. Right? I'm laboring this because I want you to see how the people at the time of Jesus saw this chapter. And I'm going to come to those measurements in a moment. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand, there stood one before me who looked like a man. I heard a man's voice from the Uli calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. The voice is clearly the voice of the visible Yahweh. Shall we say? Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And as I came near the place where I was standing, as he came to the place where I was standing, I was terrified, fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me. Interesting, isn't it? Because remember, it just means human. It just means man. Man. Understand the vision. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button and lost my place. That concerns the end of time. Or rather, the time of the end. Now, hang on. Who's Daniel writing to? He's writing to the Jews in captivity. So he's speaking to them in the way that they understand the term. Not our end of time. Right? The end of this time. While I was speaking, I was in a deep sleep. My face to the ground. He touched me. Raised me to my feet. I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. He's telling you where I'm just been telling you. The shaggy goat's the king of Greece. The large horn between its eyes is the first king. The four horns are the ones that replace the one that's broken off, represent the four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but have not yet got the same power. In the later part of their reign, when the rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He'll become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and succeed in whatever he does. Well, he failed in Egypt, but we can, live with the rest of it. He'll destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He'll cause deceit to prosper. He'll consider himself superior. And when they feel secure, he'll destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. And yet he'll be destroyed, but not by human power. He died, incidentally, from illness. The vision of the evenings and mornings given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. It was the distant future to Daniel, but it's not the distant future to us. And I, Daniel, was worn out, I lay exhausted for several days, and I got up and went about the king's business, appalled by the vision because it was beyond understanding. Wow. Remember the future to Daniel. The last days to Daniel might not be the future to us, but might be in the past. So Antiochus Epiphanes, let's just have a look at this guy for a second. We're going to do some questions and answers in a moment. That's where he looks like, incidentally. You can see he looks a classic Greek. Yeah. Even wearing the Greek headband, Greek haircut. Yeah. That's his coins, which you can still buy on the market today. Not very much money if you want to buy a little memento of Antiochus. See me afterwards. I want to point an important way to think about prophecy. Does the text of Daniel fit the Maccabees' rebellion revolt? In fact, I'm going to suggest that virtually the whole of the book of Daniel does fit this whole time period. Let's go to these 2,300 days. It's either 2,300 days, which is 6 a bit years. Most refer to it as 1,150 actual days because of evenings and mornings. And that's really the Greek grammar against the Hebrew grammar. But as I've tried to show you tonight, we can't trust the Hebrew quite as much as we might have expected. It doesn't have vowels in it. Not only does it not have vowels, sometimes the Greek is proved to be the only trustworthy text. Whichever way, I can make this work. Because on the 15th of Chislev in the year 145, the king erected the statue of Greece in the temple, the abomination of desolation. On the 25th of Chislev in 145, the sacrifice was offered to it. And the restoration, the cleaning after the Maccabees' rebellion took place, is recorded in the 25th of Chislev, the year 148. So, let's think about this 1,150. The Jewish year was 355 days. If we multiply that up, we get 118.2. If it's solar, it's 1149.75. Well, hang on. That is like a quarter of a day short of the 1,150. Yeah? Well, that I think I can take that to the bank. Does that sound fair? Yeah? And even if it was full days and it was the 6 years, 4 months, actually, if you look, we'll find that the Jews were oppressed in total just over 6 years under the tyranny of Antiochus. So I don't think the Seventh-day Adventists have got this right at all. Interestingly enough, they're falling apart at the moment over this very prophecy. Because to make this work for their prophecy, they've got to equate the little horn that boasts and goes against God and abomination as Christ. To make it work in the way they write it up in their original writings. So, yeah. 1 Maccabees. I just wanted to quote you some verses because you probably never read it. Jews and his brothers said, "Now our enemies have been defeated. Let's go and purify the sanctuary and dedicate it." On 25th of the 9th month, Chislev, in the year 148, they rose at dawn, offered a lawful sacrifice, the new altar and the burnt offering which they made. Now, incidentally, you'll have heard of Hanukkah. That refers to this. What happened was as part of the cleansing ceremony, they couldn't do the ceremony unless the menorah candlestick was lit. They started manufacturing the oil for the candlestick, but it was going to take about a week. There was only a tiny bit left. So they put it in the menorah and they lit it, expecting it to go out after a few hours. After a day, it was still alight. The end of the second day, it was still alight. And the third day, so while they were doing all of the cleansing of the temple celebrations, it was still alight. On the 5th day, it was still alight. On the 6th day, it was still alight. On the 7th day, it was still alight. On the 8th day, it was still alight, and they had the new oil to put in the menorah, and it didn't go out. That's what the Jews celebrate at Hanukkah. And it's the feast in December that Jesus went to. It's the only feast that the Jews keep in December. Jesus kept Hanukkah. Not biblical, but Maccabean. Embedded in the time of Jesus. Absolutely. They all saw the importance of the Maccabees. Jesus refers to the book of Maccabees in Matthew's Gospel. And it's interesting because he now reuses some of this. But he not only reuses it, he ends up almost quoting the book of Maccabees. So he says in Matthew, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel, the prophet, standing in the holy place," and then it says, "Let the reader understand." And then if you go to 1 Maccabees 5:57, the king erected the abomination of desolation above the altar. Yeah. Now, if it's just that one, then it mightn't be that strong. But now it says this. Let's do the Maccabees one first. Maccabees went through the town shouting at the top of his voice that everyone who's got the further of the law take his stand on the covenant. Come out and follow me. And they fled with his sons to the hills, leaving all their possessions behind in the town. Jesus said, "Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let he who's on the housetop not go down to the things that are in his house." Let who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. He's referencing Maccabees yet again. Maccabees 1, 2, 9. Her babies have been slaughtered in the streets, her young man by the enemy's sword. Jesus said, woe to those who with child and nurse babes in those days. Pray that your flight isn't in winter or the Sabbath. Pray that your flight might not be in winter. Sorry, I put that down twice. Why does he say that in particular? Because Antiochus ordered them to come out, and they said, we refuse, we're not going to obey the king's orders and profane the Sabbath day. They refused to surrender on the Sabbath. Jesus said, pray that when it happens again, it won't be on the Sabbath. Which gospel is Jesus quoting from, all this quote from? From Matthew. Matthew is the gospel to the Jews. And the abomination of desolation was set up in winter on the 8th of December, 176. Matthew said, for there will be a great tribulation such as hasn't occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. Then Antiochus issued a proclamation to his whole kingdom that there would be a single people, renouncing particular customs. Messengers sent to Jerusalem, the towns of Judah, directing them to adopt the customs foreign to their country, banning burnt offerings, sacrifices, libations from the sanctuary, profaning Sabbaths and feasts, defiling the sanctuary and sacred ministries, building altars, precincts, shrines for idols, sacrificing pigs and unclean beasts, leaving the sons uncircumcised, prostituting themselves to all kinds of impurity and abomination. So they would forget the law and revoke their observance of it, and anyone not obeying the king's command was to be put to death. Any books of the law that came to light were torn up and burned. Anyone having a copy of the covenant or practicing the law was sentenced to death. And I've said about women. Prophecy. This is the best way that I'm going to be able to describe it to you. Imagine a beam of light being shone into a prison. I know you just thinking Dark Side of the Moon and Pink Floyd album cover. I can see it written in your face. You needn't say anything. Think of it this way. A prophecy might have a first fulfillment. And then it might have a fragmentary fulfillment. And then it might have a final fulfillment. So what we're going to see is Daniel's prophecy, maybe the light coming through and hitting the prism of time. And we see absolutely in the book of Maccabees the answers to what's going to go on in Daniel. And we'll look at chapter 9 next week. I will cut the recap down next week. I just felt there were so many people missing last time. I didn't want to inconvenience. But then, equally, it shines into AD 70. And much of Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the events of the temple. We somehow want to make it always about us. And then into end times. And there is, definitely. Daniel says there will be the abomination in the temple. Happens in Maccabees. Happens with Rome. And it will happen again. How do we know it will happen again? The book of Revelation. Right? But it's interesting because this is how prophecy works. It becomes fragmented and split. You see, it's not simple. It really isn't simple. Jesus engages with Daniel in a new way, first claimed to be the Son of Man, but also his own prophecies that he gives as his credibility as a prophet. He is a prophet as well as king, as well as Son of God. Prophet, priest, and king. We see the throwing forward of the prophecies. And so what I say is what makes it challenging and not simplistic is simply, is it about the time of Maccabees? Is it the time of Jesus? Or is it the end times? And I'm saying yes and no to all three. let's not go for the simplistic answers, but let's just try to be careful students of the Word. I said this, not about our preachers, Luke, just incidentally. This is not a comment about our preachers. You got that? But preachers need to stop trying to make the Bible fit what they expect tomorrow in order to become leading second coming teachers with something new to say. This is about the internet. Prophecy of the past is rarely used and understood by the people at the time of its fulfillment. Who, for example, would have saw at the time of Jesus that Balaam's prophecy could come true with the Magi? Yeah. And all the other prophecies that came true during the life of Jesus, they were looking for a Messiah that was a conqueror, not a suffering Messiah. All those prophecies are plain, but they're only plain to us now. Look for the coming of the Lord. The time is short. But there again, it was short 2,000 years ago, because that's when we quoted from. The time is short, Paul says. It is short, but not in the way we think. It's short narratively, not by the clock. But there are some key markers that lets us think we're in the last days. Israel becoming a nation again opens the door for the third temple. But how long is that going to take? Will it be 500 years before the third temple's built? I don't know. The gospel's nearly been preached to the whole world, but it depends how you interpret exactly what's said. In some ways, it's more important to understand that Jesus is framed by Daniel and how Jesus is a real prophet too. That's more important. That's the biggest thing we can get from it. And just lastly on this, he gave a warning to the generation, as a prophet does, to repent with an imminent punishment on the horizon. That's what the prophets did. But it's interesting because the Christians left Israel in two separate occasions. Persecution spread them out of the place. That saved their lives. Their desire to look after the poor meant that they sold their goods and their houses. Guess what? They could walk away very easily because the things that would have been encumbrances around the neck would have probably got them killed. And they left Jerusalem in 62 AD, the ones that were left, walked out en masse out of Jerusalem in 62 AD because they recognized some of the signs that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24. Finally, Josephus even records that at that time there were stars falling from the sky, the moon turned to blood, at the very time of the Roman conquering of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So again, remember this. Not every feature of a prophecy has to be fulfilled every time. And this makes going to the book of Daniel very difficult, because if we try and say, oh, well, this little bit has to apply in the future to this, you'll probably as wrong as you will be as right. Let's see it as the wonderful thing that it is, that this was prophesied long before these events happened, that Jesus uses prophecy in a particular way, and that should help us understand prophecy better. And let's look next week at chapter 9, where it starts to get even more exciting. Bless you.